person here, and I will hand it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so humbled by your introduction, Dr. Arian Hannemeyer. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for honoring my presentation with your presence. So my presentation today is on pain and suffering, racialized immigrant women's compliance and defiance to psychiatric discourses and treatments in Canada. Dr. Hannemeyer already introduced me. So before beginning my presentation, I would like to do some land acknowledgement of Brandon University. Brandon University campuses are located on Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 lands, homelands of Dakota, Anishinaabe, Ozique, Cree, Dene, and Métis people. So in this presentation, I would like to make some claim based on 13 racialized immigrant women's accounts and my own interpretation of women's accounts. And when I'm talking about my own interpretation, that means my own interpretation. And this is one reading of this account. There might be multiple readings of my women's account. So I'm very grateful to these women for sharing their intimate stories of pain and suffering and their experiences of using mental health services with me. I'm also thankful to the seminar organizing committee for this opportunity and for inviting me here. Thank you, Dr. Arian Hannemeyer, for connecting me with this group and for your financial support for this trip. So let's start. So this is the overview of my presentation. So I will discuss 3 key themes, theoretical framework and methodology very briefly. And mostly I will actually share women's stories and narratives relating to key themes to support my claim. And I also conclude this presentation with the key points of 3 themes. So the first theme of this presentation today is how some women with diverse cultural and geopolitical backgrounds reflected on psychiatric discourses when they were emotionally damaged by their pain and suffering. Second, how their pain was categorized by mental health professionals and how the women were provided treatments. And the third theme will be how the women complied and or defied the treatments and psychiatric categorization. So as you may know that within mental health services, the medical model is dominant, arguing that mental illnesses have an individual biological biochemical basis. Their diagnosis and treatments generally rely on the idea that mental illness is a naturally occurring pathology that exists within sufferer and that can be objectively defined and measured following the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorder, in brief, DSM's explanatory model of mental illnesses. However, in this presentation, I engage in an intersectional interrogation of psychiatric discourses, categorization, and treatment, and my interrogations have been informed by 4 scholarly traditions: Foucauldians, anti-psychiatric feminism, post-colonial, and post-colonial feminism. So initially, Foucauldian understanding of mental illnesses stimulated my work and my interrogation, and my theoretical notion of truth and reality also informed by Foucauldian notion of truth and reality, that is, truth is constructed and there isn't any truth out there that can be observed. So truth is constructed through discursive process, and this truth actually have material effect on us. And that actual theme Foucault used to examine the notion of madness and mental illness, fit, unfit, normal, abnormal notions. And to Foucault, madness is not an a priori category, but rather different social discourses and practices have developed over time to construct certain individuals as well as certain human conditions as deviant and mentally ill. I'm also critical about the notion of mental illness, so mostly I will use mental health challenges, emotional distress, damage, something like that. But when I will use mental illness, I will not use that question mark because through the discursive process, actually mental illnesses become mental illnesses. But as I will not use question mark, that doesn't mean that I'm not critical of this concept. So Foucauldian scholars and Foucault himself also very critical about psychiatric focus on compulsory feed body-mindedness because it pathologized perceived non-normative body minds, and these are very disciplinary. So that categorization was possible, according to Foucault, by the birth of clinic, prisons, and orphanages, along with the growth of medicine, criminology, social work, education, psychiatry, and psychology. So I read Foucault's famous book, Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, where Foucault explored the genealogy of madness and argued how historically madness became a negative point. Before mid-17th century, the madman was not treated in a negative sense, but during that time, the madman became a dangerous entity that brought about significant unrest to the society during that period. The impoverished vagabonds and prostitutes were categorized as mad, which acted as a strategy to govern the poor, needy, homeless, and otherwise incompetent people in a newly industrialized Western society. And their regulation was tied with the production of rational or productive citizens who could serve the need of a newly industrialized Western society. So the main point here is that it's a historical process and social norms and contexts inform the categorizations of some people or some human condition as abnormal and fit. However, also medical knowledge and psychiatric knowledge that is controversial. We often actually don't think these notions critically, and we often actually take and consult psychiatric categorization and identity and docile our bodies and minds and identity following the categorization. So globally, the American Psychiatric Association has increasingly expanded diagnostic categories and their influence on individuals. As you may know, in the DSM-5, more than 400 distinct mental disorders are listed. And today, not only psychiatric professionals encourage individuals to work on their mental health so that they can be productive more, and psychiatric discourses are everywhere. The problem I see of psychiatrization is that it medicalizes individuals and operates today, stressing individuals, taking responsibility and conveying a moral load wherein wellness is characterized as a moral good and seeking it is seen as the mark of good citizen. So Foucauldian notion of fit, unfit, understanding stimulated me to reflect critically on my categorization of distress as depression and anxiety disorder and my feeling of being unfit in Canada. So I moved Canada from Bangladesh for my MA in 2014. I had some privilege in my country, but as a newcomer, I lost most of them. A different education system, language, environment, food practices, weather, and lack of family and social support all combinedly damaged my self-perception. I was always anxious if I would succeed in this new country. And 9 years before when I moved to Canada, I didn't actually use mental health services in my country, and mental health discourses and treatments were not prominent in my country. However, when I had damage, I began observing psychiatric discourses in Canada and also used mental health services in Canada, even when I actually understood that all of my damage is coming from my displacement. So that way I thought that I observed in some ways, not all are psychiatric discourses, and I see critically that these are colonizing. So I even actually changed my subjectivities following the mainstream Canadian ideal notion of subjectivities, and that subjectivity is actually prompted by psychotherapy. So in order to feel good, you have to actually assimilate to the Canadian mainstream notion of our ideal notion of subjectivity. So those things I felt is kind of colonizing. My own experiences coupled with the Foucault's analysis stimulated me to learn this group of women, such as racialized immigrant women's use of mental health services, because I anticipated that they might have similar experience, because Canada is considered one of the most diverse immigrant receiving countries in the world and known as racially innocent, but it is not, and it has a long colonizing history of indigenous people. Additionally, the immigration policy of Canada is racist, misogynistic, and also ableist. And the scholars contend that mental health services in Canada are not well equipped to provide services to culturally different people. For instance, in Canada, mental health professionals usually suggest biomedical mental health treatments and follow the dominant socio-political and cultural perspective of Canada, which is neoliberalism. That treatments often depend on patients taking individual responsibility of their care and their well-being by cultivating self-mastery, and also presumes that patient to be white. So in addition to Foucauldian literature on psychiatrization, my critical views also informed by, as I said earlier, anti-psychiatric feminist, post-colonial and post-colonial feminist scholarship. So anti-psychiatric feminism helped me to understand or think critically about psychiatric knowledge by three ways. One is psychiatric knowledge and treatments have been produced within gender culture. Second, a refusal of gender norms is seen as pathological. And third, certain aspects of women's lives are automatically deemed illness by the DSM, such as premenstrual diasporic disorder and premenopausal depression. I also needed post-colonial scholarship because I worked on racialized women and immigrant women. So I learned from post-colonial scholarship that way psychiatric knowledge is informed by the Western cultural framework and enacted racism by constructing Black and racialized people as immoral and lacking intelligence and born criminals, particularly when psychiatry discipline was developed in the West during 18th century. At that time, it helped British colonizers to sovereign other countries by constructing the notion that they are intellectually inferior compared to the white people. So that helped them to sovereign the other people in the global South. And the colonial damages are categorized as mental illness. And they also informed me how actually psychiatric knowledge replacing other ways of knowing mental health, well-being, and healing process. I also needed post-colonial feminism. Here people might have some question that why I'm using post-colonial and also post-colonial feminism. So even I look at Frantz Fanon's, I use Frantz Fanon theory, but he actually didn't talk about the women experience, like colonized women experience. So I needed post-colonial feminism because they are talking about the intersectional forms of social subordination that complicate the racialized immigrant women lives. So particularly to understand the intersectional forms of subordination, I needed post-colonial feminism. I would like to discuss briefly about my methodology. So I use feminist standpoint theory, which is very important for feminist scholar to produce women knowledge, and it also provides us the views how women face relations of ruling in their daily lives. So I did in-depth interviews with 13 racialized immigrant women who use mental health services in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. It's in a rural site, and the city is quite dominant, and there is any research on this group of women, and the mental health services actually is not equipped to provide culturally diverse people. And my analysis was informed by critical grounded theory, and themes have been emerged from the women's stories, but analyzed within the broader discussion of race, gender, racialization, neoliberalization, colonization, and psychiatrization. So this is women biographical information. You can have a look to get a sense about them. So most of the women like are under 40 but above 20, and their education background is like most of them went to the education. Actually, I had international students. Most of the women were international students, and happened their damage after their immigration. And their immigration status, they initially came as an international student, most of them, not all of them. Then some of them got their permanent residency in Canada, and a few of them came with their parents. I'm just giving a sense. So let's talk about theme 1. So women reflection on psychiatric discourses. So not all women were aware of medical notions of mental illnesses before immigrating to Canada and when they suffered in Canada. But later they learned about it from social media, schools, clinics, and other institutions. Several women said that they first went to their physicians because they couldn't bear their life. Some of these women were directed to try psychotherapy in addition to being prescribed antidepressant and other drugs. However, several women were reluctant to use mental health services primarily because of their cultural knowledge and associated practices. They didn't think that their suffering is a biological issue that needed biomedical solution. Such as you can see, Lamia said that, quote, "It is not considered as a real problem in my country. The problem is, do you have food in your house? Do you have a roof on your head? Are you physically sick? Do they have a real problem?" End quote. However, later they sought psychotherapy because of two reasons. On the one hand, they became familiar with Western biomedical mental health knowledge, and on the other hand, in a new social structure and culture, their changing subjectivities led them to feel comfortable with new medical and psychological process. Such as Jisa, one of my respondent, she said her damage happened mostly after her immigration. So she was at that time 13 years old and she couldn't speak English and she suffered a lot at her school. So every day she would go home and come from home and would cry. And she said that she went through racialization and humiliation at her school by her peers and by also her teachers. So that actually damaged her self-perception. But at that time, she was a little 13 years old and she didn't know about the mental health discourses and she didn't think that it was her depression. But when she was explaining that experience with me and sharing her experience, she mentioned that perhaps I had depression at that time because later when she had the similar condition, she went to psychotherapy and she regular basis used psychotherapy as well as antidepressant. And she absorbed totally the psychiatric discourses. So now when she recalls her previous experience and damage, she now labels that suffering and pain as like her depression. Here, however, some other women are confused about labeling or confused about labeling their distress, as Lamia said here, that quote, I wasn't doing the stuff that I enjoy, but I did not want to call it depression, or I just tell myself, oh, this week I am just going to be sad. That's what I think, or my period is coming. I have hormones. That's what I used to think. Then I was reading materials and thought, oh, I might have depression. I used to be confused about it like once in every 3 months. That's what I am depressed. I was like, oh, I am stressed from school, but I didn't know if I was depressed or I was missing home, end quote. So here I can see that Lamia wasn't fully rendered docile by the medical discourses of depression, but was instead troubled as to whether her distress could be called depression or not, even though she was diagnosed with depression by her physician. Although Lamia was confused about labeling her suffering as depression, she did affirm biomedical explanation about her premenstrual changes and identifying the experience as biologically and naturally negative and taxing for women. In this way, Lamia's stories, I argue, illuminates the multiple tensions between lived experience, lay interpretations, and Western medical and psychiatric discourses about women's bodies and emotions. So this is this table shows women use of mental health services. As you can see, all of the women use psychotherapy at least once, but not all of them use the antidepressant and other biomedicine that were prescribed to them for getting over their distress. So let's talk about women categorizations and diagnosis. So I found that although women were damaged by the structural things, most of the women were diagnosed with mental illnesses by their physicians or by themselves, following the lay discourses on mental illnesses in Canada. And majority were diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorder. The diagnoses were often combined with one or more of the following: borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic disorder, autism, obsessive compulsion disorder, or attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and postpartum depression. And I found that diagnoses were informed by the biomedical model of mental disorder, and new diagnoses were also informed by neoliberal, colonial, and patriarchal culture. And now I would like to share women's stories. to support my claim, how I found that the diagnoses were informed and happened within the context of colonial patriarchal and neoliberal culture. So here I would like to share more myths. All the names are pseudo to protect their confidentiality. Sorry, I could have said that before. So Momi said anxiousness was her common problem and it was initiated after having a premarital sexual relationship with her ex-boyfriend, as she felt guilty as it was taboo in her culture. But her anxiety had been amplified after moving to Canada. As she quote, I didn't know that it is hard to move to another country as an immigrant because everything is changing. I even couldn't talk for several months. I figured out that I am shy. I cannot talk. I ignored my feeling maybe for years. Then I figured it out. I'm not really happy. My relationship wasn't good with my ex. I was anxious about everything. I couldn't sleep well at night, and when I woke up, I had to study English. Sometimes, due to my anxiousness, I couldn't walk and work as I felt dizzy and suffered from bad nausea. I feel bad as my stories didn't have a good ending. I really feel bad that I'm in Canada for a long time, but still I don't have enough money and a good job, end quote. So here I can see, actually it's my interpretation. So Momi's narrative represents that she experienced multiple forms of displacement. In Canada, she found herself a split colonial subject, distressed by her inability to express herself. At home, she became fragile due to intimate partner violence. She also suffered due to modern neoliberal notion of good life, which encourages individuals to take control of their own lives to be successful economically. Although patriarchal, colonial, and neoliberal structure of the context contributed to Momi's anxieties, she harshly judged herself for her inability to be a strong woman and cope with the demand of the new culture in Canada, which further exaggerated her insecurities and anxieties that she began labeling this as pathological conditions following psychiatric discourses. Momi is from a collective culture wherein lack of women empowerment or individual achievement of goal is not seen as a problem. However, in Canada, Momi and several of women in my research valued goal-directed and economically successful life, and therefore saw their inabilities to fit in with this neoliberal culture as their inherent and individual problems. This provided a clear example of the ways these women's perception of self were colonized by the adoption of Western neoliberal values. Further, these women were arguably at increased risk of being diagnosed because the same neoliberal approach is also prevalent in the healthcare system and implores patients to take individual responsibility for their cure. Momi's categorization and her self-blame for not being able to solve her suffering on her own both occurred within these neoliberal structures. Momi realized that due to her anxiousness, she couldn't sleep and sometimes couldn't even walk, often suffering from dizziness and nausea so severe that she went to several doctors, one neurologist and a psychiatrist, and had a CT scan of her brain to identify the root cause. One of her doctors explained that dizziness is a middle-age problem of women and a result of women's hormonal change, and provided treatment based on this assumption. Momi submitted to health professionals gender knowledge and used antidepressant for 6 years with occasional drug-free intervals, along with using counseling services in an effort to quiet her mind and emotion. Nonetheless, she wasn't recovered. So let's talk about women compliance. So I found that women compliant in GWS, comply to the psychiatric discourses in GWS by seeing distress as pathology, taking up a psychiatricized identity, and governing lives through the categorizations, and third, complying with treatments. So I saw that several women fully complied with the treatments, and Emily is one of the women who complied with the psychiatric treatments and categorization, or even echoed the psychiatric knowledge to me. So she said actually she suffered a lot because of our sexist and racist office culture, and because of our struggle to taking care of our newborn baby. However, when she went to psychotherapist, and psychotherapist sent her to her family doctors, and family doctors did some tests and immediately diagnosed her with postpartum depression because she had a baby. And she put that, women can have postpartum depression at any time within 3 years of delivery, because it takes 3 years to settle down the hormones of women after giving a birth, end quote. So here again, we can see that this office damaging of sexist and racist office culture, and she didn't have any support to take care of her baby, altogether contributed her damage, but the doctor actually identified her problem as biological and causing from the hormones. So it's problem because when you are just pointing out biological things, it's actually delimits to look at how structural things are damaging for your mental health. So I would like to share Natasha and Neela's stories to support my claim how they actually took up a psychiatricized identity. So first, I would like to share Neela's story. So Neela underwent a wide array of psychiatric treatments and was diagnosed with diverse mental illnesses, including autism, generalized anxiety disorder, depression disorder with bipolar, attention deficit disorder with obsessive compulsive disorder. She said that she was taken to the psychiatrist when she was 6 years old in her home country because she was friendless, lonely, and different from her peers. And her mother perceived such concerns as an indication that Neela needed medical attention. When Neela shared her stories with me, she told that she didn't like that because she thought she didn't have any psychological issue at that time, but still her mother took her to the psychiatrist. While Neela was critical about her mother's decision to take her to a psychiatrist, she appeared to categorize her friendliness and loneliness as pathological and the result of her autism. So Neela told me that she was diagnosed with autism as she couldn't make a proper connection with people or convey her emotion, and because of this, she doesn't have friends. She discussed how she often monitors her expression and behaviors, as she thinks that because she is autistic, she cannot communicate appropriately. And she said, quote, "Maybe the way I express my actual face, the emotion I feel, it seems muted to people somehow. I try not to. You might have noticed during our conversation shifting my piece a lot, and that's another thing that I try to modulate my speech so that people think of me as less robotic. But it still tends to be happen, and people still tend to be intimidating by me." Quote. So the stories represent Neela's continuously scrutinize her behavior and life and see herself a kind of lacking, which I argue is very disciplinary. The same thing happened with Natasha. So Natasha was identified with borderline personality disorder and BPD, along with depression and anxiety disorder. Natasha then underwent a wide array of medical and mental health investigation and treatments to identify the root causes of her pain, and she complied with the psychiatric treatments. She said, quote, "The whole time I had borderline personality disorder, and anxiety and depression are just symptoms of it. Borderline personality disorder is a type of disorder you don't really know who you are. It's like a specific set of characteristics in a person that makes them very hard to make friends with and very like dysfunctional, and yeah, it is very complicated, and I was just diagnosed with it," end quote. So here Natasha has drawn heavily upon expert knowledge and began to see her personality as problematic. She further expressed her frustration that because she has BPD, she finds herself unable to create meaningful relationship with friends and or a man she dated, and doesn't feel stable, finding herself extremely happy one day and awfully miserable in the next day, to the point where she has attempted suicide and self-harm several times. She went to describe herself as a risk taker as she abruptly moved to Lethbridge in an attempt to escape sexual and domestic violence. Natasha says her parents wanted her to be a tough person and have a successful career as a doctor, but she didn't succeed academically. So here it is important to note that Natasha said her damage happened by her sexual harassment by her father and physical violence by her mother and brother at home. And as she had experienced domestic violence, she escaped from home. And she also said she went through racialization. So when she was child, so all together contributed her damage. And she had been using mental health services when she was 17. So here are following some feminist scholars, and I argue that she was categorized with the BPD because she actually took some risks, and the behavior that society perceived as aggressive. And this trait actually is not usual or normative for women. And as Natasha actually didn't follow the normative notion of womanhood, that's why she was categorized with BPD. But here, her actually reaction to the violence is overlooked. So this way, actually, we think how psychiatric categorization is informed by highly gendered culture. And for Natasha, gender along with racial power relations are significant issues to understand her damage. Natasha has undergone a range of treatments and medication. She found an antidepressant helpful, and she told that without antidepressant, she cannot actually function in her daily day. And she told me that, quote, "Doctors give drugs because it helps to change your brain. It stimulates different parts of the brain, but it teaches your brain to do it itself. So like there is high chance that I don't have to be on medication forever. It's just like for now. And if my brain never learns to be happy on its own, that's fine. I will just keep taking medication," end quote. So in Natasha's life, antidepressant therapy has operated as a form of biopower by encouraging her to govern her mind to align with a neoliberal happy selfhood in Canada, and through her active desire and participation to achieve these goals. Her stories align with scholars' assertion that the philosophy of antidepressants has been influenced by neoliberal principles. Individuals are given medication to alleviate negative emotions as they are seen as barrier to happiness and productivity. Although sadness and happiness can coexist and are normative reactions to an individual's life events, the emotion of sadness has been pathologized within neoliberal contexts that insist upon individuals' high productivity. Thus, Natasha's categorization, I argue, illustrates her diagnosis by herself and by her physician has been influenced by neoliberal notions that highlights individuals' need to maintain stability. Now, I would like to discuss about women defiance. So within this systematically racist structure and gender structure, it is hard to resist colonial and patriarchal power, particularly when they presented in the form of social good, saving and protecting human lives and health, such as in the case of medical and psychiatric knowledge. Yet, in my research, some of the women defy psychiatric treatments because of their reliance on cultural ways of feeling their pain and because of their dissatisfaction with the services and biomedicine. So one example, so two things actually informed women defiance. One is women reliance on conflicting cultural beliefs and another is their dissatisfaction with mental health services. So here I would like to share Jillian's narratives to support my claim. So Jillian said she came to Canada when she was 15 years old and she was happy with her family. But when she moved to Lethbridge, she actually was suffering, but because she was living by herself and she started her post-secondary education at the University of Lethbridge, and she wasn't doing homework and she was staying at home and in bed of most of the time. But still, Jillian didn't identify any of these behaviors as symptoms of depression because in her community and families, such life states are simply perceived as laziness, and those experiencing this feeling are advised to just get up and start working and to pray to the God. However, in her second year, having been exposed to the psychiatric discourses, she did seek out counseling services at her university. However, she stopped after her only a single use of services as she ultimately felt that psychiatric knowledge and treatments were too contradictory to her cultural and family definition of mental illnesses and her healing practices. Following this experience, Jillian began praying and relying on God and along with strengthening her community connection to improve her well-being. And she said, quote, I had doubts about the existence of mental illness and I think is a Western thing. For some people, it is real. For some, it is not. My brother told me mental illness is not real and antidepressants are placebo, end quote. So here I also actually shared another woman, Lamia stories, who actually avoided biomedicine, but she took psychotherapy. So here the claim is, I'm not reading the other quotation. So here the claim is that Lamia took some part of the psychiatric discourse where resisted or defied one another psychiatric discourses. Here's that the women use of mental health services actually cannot be understood by employing the simple model of compliance and defiance. It's more complex. So they would combine the psychiatric discourses and their cultural discourse of healing and mental illness. Some women actually took some of the knowledge from the psychiatric discourses and treatments and resisted others. And so, as I said, some women resisted or defied psychiatric knowledge because they didn't like mental health services. Such as Neela said that, I think psychiatry is bullshit. because I have all this diagnosis, but 90% is based on like a little questionnaire that changes from time to time. And the answer can change by the mood of a person. ... I took many antidepressants, but I stopped when I had a fluidity attack. I tried Effexor first, that didn't work, then Cipralox, and that worked for a while. Then I tried fluoxetine in the last spring, that ruined my life. I took 5 milligrams of 3 days in a row, and I was suicidal for basically for all of that week, and I couldn't do anything for most of the next week, and my life was collapsing. So because of that, I stopped taking the drugs in Nila. So antidepressants have even created some permanent discomfort for Nila, and some scholars argue that antidepressants really have dangerous side effects on human being. And in my research also, some women really experienced side effects. So even though this antidepressant, even psychiatrists know that antidepressants are not that effective, they often actually prescribe to its patients. So we need to actually critical about this prescription and medicalization. So I think I am just near to my presentation, and I would like to conclude my presentation by pointing out 3 key points of 3 themes. So the key point for the first thing is most women view their distress finally as indicator of their psychiatric pathology. And the main point of second thing is women's distress was explained as a biological issue. Their diagnoses were informed by gender, neoliberal and colonial culture, social contexts were disregarded. And third one is women's responses to and pursuit of psychiatric and medical knowledge cannot be understood by utilizing simplistic defiance and compliance debate. Thank you everybody for listening to me.
Okay, so I'm going to moderate your Q&A for you, so you don't have
Okay.
to